So it's important to remember that most findings that we have as psychologists are transmitted through writing scholarly papers and articles. Now, this is not the only way in which we communicate. There are conferences and there are other means by which people communicate: blogs, Facebook, um, Twitter. But for the most part, writing journal articles is what you need to do if you are a psychologist that does work in academia. And so there are various discourse communities, or we could also call them invisible colleges of people who are interested in particular topics that psychologists deal with. And invisible because it's not as if there's a one place that you go where everyone studies psychology. It's a diffuse community of people that are spread out over many institutions, and we call that an invisible college. But it's undeniable that being a good writer is essential to being a good researcher. Whether it's in sharing information, applying for grants, or getting tenure if you're a professor, it's really important to be able to write well. And this is not just true for psychology, this is true for almost anything that you do. I often tell students that, someday all of us will be gone, and there will only be our words that are left to bear witness to our existence. So you might as well leave good words behind so that, people will judge you positively once you're no longer around. It's a little depressing, sorry about that, but I figured I'd mention it. So in psychology, there's various types of writing of different lengths. Now, one type of writing is abstracts, which basically constitute brief, maybe at most one-page summaries of findings. Abstracts aren't common in every discipline in psychology, but writing an abstract is often part of writing journal articles because most journal articles that are published need to have an abstract that accompany them. And so an abstract is an important piece of writing. Now, the second longest would be journal articles, which a journal article is just like a magazine article, except you could say that they're much more boring and about topics that only a few people on Earth are interested in. But when you publish a journal article, you're publishing a short, between 5 and at most probably 50-page articles outlining your finding that you have in your lab. And so that is the most common way in which we communicate. For instance, I've published something like 25 or 30 journal articles in various journals, and that's how most psychologists work. So most people, when they publish, are publishing journal articles. There are also monographs, which are longer. They're larger than 50 pages, reports of research finding. And they typically are published as a small book or as an entire issue of a journal. So, there are not many monographs. Monographs aren't as common these days because very few people are working on topics that are so broad that you could dedicate 50-page reports for their findings. Not that it's non-existent anymore, but it's just not as common as maybe it once was. Now, another way in which people communicate is through chapters, which are basically a chapter, just like a chapter in a book. They're between probably 5 and 50 pages, where they review research programs, and they typically appear in a book with other people. So, for instance, I might have an idea that I want to write a book that is an edited volume where other people write a variety of chapters. And so I contact everyone that I know that does research in this area, and I ask them, would you be interested in submitting a chapter to the book? And most people say yes, and you give them maybe 6 months or a year to write it, and it ends up going into their book. And the problem with chapters is something that we'll talk about in a little bit, which has to do with peer review, but we'll get that in a moment. Also, books. It's possible, if you have a big enough idea, to write an entire book, to write a book-length study, but that's kind of rare today. It's not often that people are publishing books in the 21st century, and there's a lot of reasons for that. For one, The internet has made communication that much more quick, and the publishing of books is a really slow process. So people generally would prefer to have things appear as articles and have them come out quickly as opposed to taking months and months and months for a finding to come out. But also, if you have to read a whole book to get someone's idea, that's a real investment in time. And therefore, I think that that's why people enjoy journal articles because they're short, to the point, and they're, probably the most common way that people in psychology communicate. Now, for this course, you're probably going to have to write a research project, and you're going to write it in the form of a journal article, except that in this summer course, you're not going to be collecting data, so you're not going to have a methods section. You're just going to be writing something that might even sound a little bit more like a proposal, a research proposal, or the first third of what a journal article would look like. So, what you're going to need is have a title page, an abstract, 5 to 7 pages of actual text, and a works cited page. And you'll be writing this paper as if you were submitting something to an actual journal. Now, of course, because you're not actually going to be conducting a research study, this is not something that you will be submitting to a journal. But I want you to, for a minute, pretend as if this is what you're doing. And that's kind of the goal of what you're going to be doing when you'll be writing this paper. So, just like you have in other classes, your first step in designing a paper is coming up with a thesis, which is a proposition that's supported by an argument. It's the central argument of your paper. So imagine that I am interested in what are called sensitive periods in development, which is that there are certain periods in development where you're really good at being able to learn something, but then later you're not able to, such as language. It's really easy for a toddler to pick up a language, but when you're doing it in high school, it's a lot harder because there's a window of opportunity that closed. And so you might propose that an old dog can't learn new tricks because there's a sensitive period in a dog's life for learning new tricks, and once that point is passed, it is impossible to teach a dog new tricks. Or alternatively, that you propose that an old dog can learn new tricks, however, it takes longer for an old dog to learn a trick than a younger dog. So your thesis is basically an argument that you make that you subsequently follow up with evidence, and that evidence is in the form of other people's work on that topic. So that's why you need to be able to engage the literature and do a good literature review by finding out what other people have done already on the area that you're doing your paper on. So for a research paper, a typical one will have a title page, have a page that contains the abstract, and then the main body of text. Now, for your paper, it's probably only going to contain an introduction. But if you were doing a research study where you actually collected data, you would have a method section, a results section, and a discussion session. And those sections would be describing what you did to collect data and what you found. But since this is a course which only has a 4-week period, there's not enough time to do that. So we're just going to do the introductory part. But you will have to include references, and because you don't have data, you won't be including tables and graphs. But it's important for you to include the reference section. Now, the title page typically contains the title of the paper, followed by the authors, and the author's affiliation, their contact information, such as their university address and email, and everything should be centered. So an example might look like this. Here is a paper I once wrote where I have the title at the top, How Infants Encode Spatial Extent, and I have myself at the top there, Sean Duffy, Rutgers University, and then I have 3 other people who are associated with the University of Chicago, and then I have the correspondence where I say address correspondence to Sean Duffy, Rutgers University, Camden, and my email address. It's often you would also put a mailing address, but I don't think that I've actually received mail from a journal article for submitting a journal article in 10 years. So email address is probably enough. Now your abstract is typically a short Sometimes journals will say it has to be less than 50 words. Sometimes they'll give you 150 words, but very rarely will they let you do more than 150 words. But it's basically a short summary of your paper and your research findings. Now, it's important to wait and do your abstract last, because sometimes you don't understand the subtlety of what the argument that you're going to be making in your paper. And so it's best to write your paper and then summarize it yourself afterwards. And an important thing to keep in mind at this point that I want to, just point out to everyone is that, for every 100 people that encounter your work, okay, who search for your literature and when, or search for the topic that you're doing your work on, and they find your article, 95%, so 95 out of the 100 people, the only thing that they will read is your title of the article. Okay? 4 people, or 4%, will go so far as to read the abstract. And only one of the 100 people will actually read your article. So this is why you need to put great care into writing your abstract, because and of course your title, because the vast majority of people, that's all they're going to actually read. It's only a small minority of people that actually will end up reading your whole paper. So here is an example of an abstract. This is from a student who was in my class several years ago, and what she did is a study on seeing whether or not putting a smiley face on a check, she worked at a restaurant, would increase the proportion tip. And so what she wrote was, servers in restaurants often employ the tactic of writing on the back of customers' checks before delivering them to dining parties. Research has shown that servers can increase their tip percentages by drawing smiley faces, writing thank you, or providing helpful messages on the back of customers' checks. In the current study, drawing smiley faces, writing the words thank you, and combining these two variables are examined in relationship to tip percentages. An experiment was conducted in which a female server added one or both of these variables to checks before delivering them to her customers. It was predicted that combining the two variables would result in a higher tip percentage than simply presenting the customer with one or neither. The results were marginally consistent with the prediction and showed a slight trend in tipping behavior and written messages. So this is basically the summary of what her paper was. And even though I would argue that this is a bit wordy and that if I were to edit this, I would cut out maybe 30 or 40 words from this, it's just an example of what an abstract should be. It simply summarizes the findings that you have of your research. And that is a really important thing to know how to write. Now, I do want to say that when you write an abstract, what you're going to find is it's very hard to fit all of your ideas in less than 150 words or less than 100 words or less than 50 words, of course. So you have to be very judicious with how you write. And so what you end up doing is really carefully looking at what words you could cut out. So for instance, you might want to cut out, instead of saying on the backs of customer checks, you could just say on customers' checks. So you end up, when you're writing like this, you end up doing something where it's like editing word by word in order to get under the limit. And that's very common. A lot of academic writing is cutting back. And there's kind of a funny story with this. I always talk to students about the fact that when you're starting out in academia, you're a student, and a professor asks you to write 7 pages, you struggle to get those 7 pages. So you do everything to make it look like you wrote more than you actually did. You'll play with the distance between letters, which is called kerneling. You play with the font. You might, play with the margins just to get to 7 pages. However, once you get good at this and once you end up writing a lot, what you end up realizing is that the real challenge is to try to fit all of your ideas into a limited space. So, for instance, many journals have a limit of 4,000 words, that your article can't be more than 4,000 words. What you often end up doing is spending many, many hours cutting back, shaving sentences off, cutting away, or editing down sentences that are too long. And that basically is the main thing that you're going to end up doing later in your career is, how do I cut back? Not how do I make it look like I wrote more than I actually did. How do I make it less than I actually did? And that's an important thing. And when you realize that that's happening to you, you realize that you've made it in academia. So, in your introduction, what you're going to be doing is presenting an overview of the thesis, an argument, and it reviews prior studies on the topic. Um, I often tell students that there should be a paragraph that begins with the phrase, prior research shows that, and then you go on and you describe what prior research has shown. And you want to cite at least 3 or 4 studies in that part, because no matter what topic you choose, there has to be at least 3 or 4 people that have looked at it themselves before. And so what you also do is define some of the problems with prior research. Not every study that's been done is perfect. And the reason why you're doing the study that you're doing is to improve upon what has already been done. So I would say that another paragraph should be, but there are limitations of prior research. Although I wouldn't start a paragraph with the word but. But the point is that you want to have something in there that says what prior research did, and also why there's limitations of prior research that your study addresses. Because if there isn't any problem with prior research, then there's really no reason for you to be writing a paper about it. And if you're doing an experiment, you use the introduction to also provide an introduction to the experiments that you plan to conduct. So you don't want to describe them in detail, but you want to give a little bit of a hint as to what they're about. Now, this is not necessarily for your paper, but in reading papers, you're going to find method sections that have these parts. And I just want to explain to you briefly what they are, so that when you come across them, you'll know what you're reading. So the introductory part of the paper just describes prior research. It describes a little bit of what you plan to do, but the method section describes what you actually did to collect data. So it's the heart of it. It's where you present the study that you've conducted. So most method sections have a section that's labeled, a subsection, participants, where it says who was studied and perhaps what they received for their participation. So imagine I did a study with 48 infants. I might say that 48 infants were tested in my laboratory. Their parents were paid $10 for their time, or they were given a stuffed teddy bear, or I studied 50 undergraduates who did the experiment as part of a course requirement, and they got 1 credit for participating. You basically want to say who your participants were and what did they get for participating. Next is a section and sometimes is combined with the next one. So sometimes it's materials separate from design, and sometimes I've seen materials and design, where you talk about what kind of testing apparatus did you use, the kind of test that was given, or the stimuli that was presented. So imagine that you gave people a scale of self-esteem. You might want to say that we utilized Rosenberg's 1965 scale of self-esteem, and that would be under the material. Now, under design, what you would put are, you would explain the various, what we call treatments, and the condition used, and whether or not assignment was randomized, and so on. So we're going to get later into this course into experimental design, but that's going to be the section that says whether or not did you do a study in which you tested the same person twice, or did you identify 2 groups that you tested, or did you randomize people into groups. That's going to be in the design section. And then in the procedure section describes how you actually tested participants. So you might say participants came into my lab and they were seated down in front of a computer, and the computer ran a program that asked them to fill out these questions. Whatever it is, it basically will tell people what happened when people came into the lab for your experiment. And next, what you find is a results section. And the results section contains details about the data. So, for instance, you will commonly find something that describes the average result for a group, or the correlation between two variables that you may have collected. And also a variety of different what are called inferential statistics tests, such as, and again, this will give you a flashback from your statistics class. You might see a report of what's called an ANOVA, or a t-test, or a regression. And these are just ways in which we analyze data, tools that we use. They're not that complicated. Computers run them for us. But if you ever look at a results section and you see something where they use a capital F and then there's brackets and there's numbers, that's an ANOVA. Or if you see a T and a bracket with a number in it and other output, that's a t-test. Pretty simple. We're going to go over that again in a slide that's on reviewing statistics. But also in that section will be figures and tables. So if you have data that you want to summarize, you'll put it in there. And although you'll provide a basic summary of the findings, you're generally not going to be providing an elaborate accounting in the results section. You're not going to be interpreting what you found. That's for the next section, which is the discussion section. So in the discussion section, what you do is that you interpret your results and tie them to the introduction. So if you say that, for instance, you were studying self-esteem and that there are problems with the traditional measures of self-esteem, and so what you did is you developed a new tool that measures self-esteem, and in the results section you reported what you found. What you would say in the discussion section is that we did a study in which we came up with a new measure of self-esteem, and we found this, and what we found is different than what traditional measures were used. And then you can go on and describe why that's important and what theoretical implications that would have. And that's where you kind of can elaborate a bit on what your findings are. Most discussion sections contain a discussion of the limitations of the research, because all research has certain limitations, and also to propose topics for future research. You might say that, although we studied and came up with a new way of measuring self-esteem, there might be even better ways in the future that we could, look at and, provide some suggestions for your thoughts on what the direction of future research in this topic should look like. And then, end up with a conclusion, which is sort of like a, last statement about your findings. And that's all that's in the overall discussion.